All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the third episode of the Strength Coach Roundtable. Our last month's roundtable, we talked about strength training specifically for rowing performance, but an often missed training consideration is that it doesn't actually matter how perfect your training or training program is if you aren't healthy enough to display it to your full ability. So in this episode of the Strength Coach Roundtable, we will be talking about strength training specifically for injury prevention this time. So Blake Gorley and Joe DeLeo are back with me here, and we're going to get right into this. Let's go ahead and start with a few examples of injuries that we see in rowers and how strength training can prevent them. Blake, do you want to start?
Sure. Um, yeah, I think it can prevent like the majority of injuries that even happen. I do think we need to start and really kind of address the idea that it's not necessarily injury prevention; it's more of injury reduction because injuries do happen, and there's definitely many opportunities where you need to go and see a medical practitioner as opposed to just a trainer. Um, but I think a lot of it can be reduced from happening in the first place if it's made a priority and if there's really an effort um, to attack injuries. And I would say like almost every single injury that ends in an itis, which tends to be an inflammation like tendonitis or bursitis. I think a lot of strength training and just being progressive and planned and um, just going step by step, I think a lot of those injuries can be prevented.
Cool. Joe, you got our next one?
Sure. So, kind of the three that come to mind off the bat are, low back, rib, and the knee. Seem to be some of the more prevalent injuries that occur in the sport. We can get into the details of each one later, but those are the three that come to mind that seem to be, the highest risk and occur the most.
Specifically, like what would a couple of those be, or what would you be looking for um, with those injuries?
In terms of symptoms.
Yeah, how would you know, or what are some examples of like specific injuries?
Sure. So, for rib, I know we're going to talk about low back later, so I'll kind of defer for that later on. But for the rib, it's, typically what you'll hear an athlete say is they'll feel discomfort in the area around the rib, so sometimes behind the shoulder blade on the backside, depending on where the injury is occurring. They could have a lot of strain of the intercostal muscles, so the muscles that are lining in between the ribs themselves, and it's usually something that's brought on by a high onset of fatigue. There's three theories kind of around the rib that I had the pleasure of going over with both from your article and then also from Dr. Jane Thornton. And the long and short of it is that there isn't a definitive lockdown cause of why it's happening. There's still theories, so the jury is still out as on to why it exactly happens.
Cool. Yeah, the rib was one that I got into for when we did the first roundtable, and we all did one article on different injuries and their preventions. And yeah, same thing. Found just a ton of variety in terms of both what the possible causes were as well as what people suggested. And it didn't seem like there was a lot of strength training research out there regarding it. I ended up talking with Jane Thornton, who you mentioned, who's a rower and doctor and researcher, as well as Anders Vinther, who is, I think, out of Denmark and worked with their national team for a while and has done a lot of research into the rib stress fracture as well, but not on the strength training side. So I think that's kind of where we want to go, particularly with this episode today, is talking about what can we do in the gym. And one of the things I think that we'll all talk about a lot is the idea of muscular balance. So rowing, people think that, okay, because it uses your arms and your legs, it's more balanced than other sports. But actually, if you look at sweep rowing, it's highly rotational, and you get a lot of muscular imbalances that result from that. But even with sculling, you can go your entire sculling career, without ever using your triceps muscles, pretty much, as there's no pushing component. So what I found with looking at this rate at the rib stretch factor stuff, um, was looking at that muscular balance, that essentially if all of your pulling muscles are highly overdeveloped and you've got an overdeveloped serratus anterior, which is one of the muscles that attaches onto the rib cage, then that can put you at risk basically just by virtue of the muscles chronically kind of giving a wrenching effect on the bone structures that it's connected to. So I know that that'll tie in with a few of our other injuries as well.
Will, could you just repeat some of that? Because I don't know if the audience missed it, but you cut out a little bit there during your explanation. I only caught the last like sentence or two.
Shoot, I'm sorry to hear that. Can you guys hear me okay right now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. I'll give it the short version then, that I was talking about the idea of muscular balance and how a lot of people think that the rowing stroke is highly balanced just because it uses your upper body and your lower body, but it so heavily relies on the pulling muscles and therefore the shoulder internal rotators that we can prevent, or as Blake mentioned, the difference between prevent and reduce injury. We could reduce the chance of injury to a lot of like shoulder and rib and upper body injuries simply by training the muscles that rowing fails to train.
Awesome. Thank you. I caught a lot more of that, all of it
Yeah,
now.
for sure. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point too. It's in my mind, there's really three ways that injuries happen in rowing, and it's imbalances, number one, like you mentioned. It's technique, which obviously everyone's trying to improve every day, and then it's overtraining or under recovery. And if you look at the majority of injuries that happen in rowing, they're these itis injuries, and they tend to be related to overtraining or under recovery. And a lot of times it's either giving people the opportunity to do something different, to work on their weaknesses, or progressively loading them step by step, as opposed to just trying to rush into it a little too fast and then the body responding and saying, and just pushing back and saying, I'm not ready for this, you need to take a break.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on that concept of rest. There are a lot of rowers who I talk to, both either online, and then it's been kind of a breaking in process working with my own team to regularly schedule in rest into their program. So I usually look for like 1 week of very reduced training load, and that could be both a weight room or on the water or both. 1 week of reduced training load per like 8 to maybe 12 weeks at most. But I also talk to a lot of rowers who can't remember the last time that they took a week off.
Yeah, I feel. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say the same thing. I think it's a great point. I hope we spend a couple minutes talking about this, because I really think it's important we stress how important the rest portion is, because we get caught up in the numbers game and the split, or the pieces, or the session, or the PR, or whatever. But the fact of the matter is the gains long term are made when you recover, when you adapt. And similar to what both of you have just said, far too many times am I having conversations where athletes are not taking any rest at all. It's 7 days a week, multiple months on end, sometimes years where they haven't taken a day off. And it's just, now you're not even getting into the part of good athletic performance. It's just bad health.
And that's my favorite too, is when people are really just beating their head over, like against a wall over it. You go on a rowing forum or something like that, and people are talking about, oh, my times are stagnated. I can't break through this wall. I'm not getting any better in the gym. And you just ask them, when was the last time you took any time off? You go, I don't know.
Yeah, and if you catch it early enough, and if you build in those rest periods, it doesn't become a problem, and you can manage it with a day off a week. But if you let it build up over time, it becomes chronic, and then sometimes it takes months to years for people to fully recover and actually return to their best.
Totally, totally. And again, I just want to stress, like, just so everybody knows, the audience knows, and it's clear, this isn't our opinion. This is science. So this is how the human body works, right? You stress it. There's an adaptation. You actually are physically breaking your body down, and you get weaker, right, when you impose stress or stimulus onto it, whether that's strength training or the cardiovascular component from rowing. And then when you rest and recover, that's when the strength or the speed or the fitness gains improve. So I think it's very important people understand that supercompensation curve concept.
One of the ways that I build this into my strength training programs, just to bring this back to strength training, is I use the block periodization system, as we've talked about before, for training. So I go from basically one 12-week block to the next. In between each block, I have a 2-week transition period. The first week is very reduced training load. So we've just come out of a hard 10 to 12-week training block. Now we're going to take a week pretty easy, and then the next week is going to be half the qualities of the previous block and half the qualities of the next block. So that kind of has the effect of ramping athletes into it, as well as providing like a structure for block, week off, transition, block, week off, transition. I think a lot of times people just forget about it, and it's not purposeful. It's just that they don't really think, oh, I've just gone from one sport to the next, and they don't think to program in that rest.
Good, Blake.
I was just gonna say I do something very similar. It's basically I plan 3 weeks at a time, and then there's a deload week, and then 3 weeks at a time a deload week, just to allow 3 weeks to stress and then 1 week to recover. I feel like that's a pretty simple and easy way for almost anyone to plan out their strength training.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of that depends on how hard you're pushing too. If you're really going hard for 3 weeks, then yeah, you're going to need that week off more frequently. If your training is a little bit more moderate, then you can probably push that to the 8 to 12 range, depending on how your training is.
Totally, I think that's a great point. And another concept or way to periodize the training is a concept called like waiving the load. So basically what you do is, instead of having that structured 3 weeks on, then you take a deload week, what you're doing throughout each week is varying the weight as well as the volume you're doing throughout the week. So, for example, if you're doing, we'll use body weight training because that's what I've done most recently. So if you're doing like body weight training, if you're training for like a one-arm push-up, on the day that you're doing a one-arm push-up, you'll be very, very low reps. You might do maybe a total of 3 to 5 throughout the entire day. And then on another day, you might be doing a regression of that, where you're doing elevated, one-arm push-up, and you might be doing something in the 10 to 15 range. And then an easy day might be you're doing, one-arm planks. So you can sort of manipulate other factors as well as, just the weight on the bar or the dumbbell or kettlebell to also kind of periodize the training too.
Yeah, good point. All right, so unless you guys have anything else to add on to that, I think that one of the issues that I've seen come up is that rowers are hesitant to start strength training because they're worried about getting hurt actually from lifting. So they're kind of throwing, the baby out with the bathwater and say, oh, well, I had a friend who got hurt once and I'm worried about getting hurt too. How can we prevent this, both from like how can rowers prevent the risk of getting hurt from lifting, because there is that risk, as well as how can we as strength coaches make sure that we're keeping athletes healthy in the weight room?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that one of my mentors mentioned all the time was, you want to start slow to fast, You want to start varied and move to specific, and you want to start simple and move to complex. And I feel like a lot of times when people don't necessarily know a lot about strength training, they do what looks cool, and that tends to be the fast, complex, specific exercises, and then they tend to get hurt. And I think that's where that statistic kind of shows up, where it makes strength training look dangerous. And I really think the best thing you can do is reach out, find a professional, get an assessment. If you can't do that, just do what you understand. Start slow with it, build into it progressively, and just continue to challenge yourself a little bit more each week.
I think it's a hard sell for a lot of workaholic rowers, but it's kind of the same idea of like you don't do a 2K test in your first week of rowing training. So I definitely agree with that on the progression side.
One of the other big factors too is like, as we're aging, right, we're losing bone mineral density. I mean, strength training is one of the things that can really combat that. And so it's not just a performance side, but you're talking about longevity, sustainability, and health too. So as you age, the higher proclivity to like fall and break your leg or your pelvis, that type of thing, increases. So having that tolerance and that tissue capacity build up through strength training is going to add benefits sort of that cross over into multiple areas.
There's a powerlifting strength coach named Chris Duffin who has a word that I really like for that, which is anti-fragile training. Basically making your body more durable against stress. That's ultimately a lot of what we're trying to do.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we're trying to stress and break down the body to rebuild it so that it's stronger, more resilient, and it can withstand either a higher training volume or greater intensity or both. And so that's what we're going for. I think all of us would agree that's what we're going for in the strength training room.
Yep. Yeah, I think that one thing too is that there are a lot of misconceptions about strength training. Just a few off the top of my head is that it's all about the max. With my college men's club team, we don't do 1 rep maxes ever. I've had one athlete in the 4 years that I've been coaching with them do a 1 rep max, and it was after the season ended over summer because he wanted to, and I supervised him through the whole thing. We'll use like a 3 or a 5 rep max, but I think that just avoiding maximal loading, it doesn't really have that much of an effect on rowing ability anyway, as long as you're still building strength. And you can basically just avoid a possibility of injury by sticking to more submaximal loads and thinking about, you're a rower, not a powerlifter. So if it's not helping you in the boat, then there's no point to throwing a bunch of more weight on the bar.
Yeah, excellent points. And another thing I thought of in terms of some of the concerns or worries that rowers and coaches have is they might get injured doing strength training. Reiterating what Blake said is make sure you're working with somebody that's qualified through certification, has been doing it, has some good experience, is going to evaluate you before you get started, and be patient with it. You need to take your time and realize that there's a lot of nuance and technique involved with a lot of these lifts. I think that's sort of lost on the surface, but they're highly proficient when you see people do complex movements, and they've been practicing for a long time, probably with a lot less weight than you might be seeing on the YouTube video that's garnering millions of hits. Yep.
Are there any exercises that are on your ban list in the weight room that you don't use because of their they're too high risk, or you see them as injury causing?
I don't do anything with like the traditional bench pull. I did it in college when I was rowing, but I've been around and seen teammates literally break ribs from doing that exercise. I know it's has a I guess strong traditional roots in the sport from some older coaches, but I haven't really ever seen great carryover into how that helps um, athletes in rowing at all. So that one's probably at the top of my list.
I don't like to use heavy back squats. Part of that probably has to do with some of the mentors that I've had, but um, I feel like a lot of rowers, at least that I've had opportunities to work with, they just aren't good squatters. And then if you're loading their spine on their back with a heavy barbell, it's just kind of an added stress that I don't see much of a benefit to. So I load them in different ways. So like I'll do a goblet squat in place of a back squat, and then I'll get into some heavier single leg work, and then to take the place for really loading the body under a heavy load, I'll do different variations of carries, so like a farmer's carry. So you get 2 dumbbells, or um, yeah, that would be the easiest. Grab 2 dumbbells and you go for a walk with it, and you just try to act like you're not carrying anything.
Yeah, I know we've talked about this off air, so I won't rant on it for too long, but Joe, totally agree with you on the bench pull. It's just such a risky one. There's too high of a risk of rib stress fractures in rowing anyway. So then you're piling it on in the stress department by uh, really loading the rib directly just through pressure with the bench. I think one interesting thing on that is that at the U.S. rowing certification course that I did, Bob Ernst was a guest instructor there, and he mentioned that he had done, I think he said it was a thesis project or something like that at some point where he looked into what the indicator is for a high performing rower. So is it the 2K test? Is it the 500-meter row? Is it the 10 stroke for watts? What is the test that has the highest predictor of future rowing ability? And according to him, I didn't see the research, but according to him, it was actually the bench pull. And he says that that's because upper body strength is so necessary, and on and on. But I think that that's a great example of an indicator that the risk of doing it is not worth the knowledge that you gain as a result of it. So yes, they might very well be something that applies or that has carryover, or I don't know exactly how to phrase that, but in doing so, you expose yourself to such a great risk that you could just as easily land yourself, riding the coaching launch for 2 weeks, as much as you would being a great rower.
Yeah, totally. I just don't see the benefits from it. I mean, I get when people look at that exercise, they're like, oh, okay, we're kind of mimicking that last part of the drive where we're coming through with the arms, but you got to think about what is inherently happening inside the body when that athlete is across a bench and they're pulling a barbell from the floor to the bench underneath. So a lot of times, when I recall myself doing it back then, and then watching teammates doing it, and then seeing it again, is that athlete will actually go into extension. So they're flexing through their spine. And now we're asking them to lift a load off the ground. So now we're placing greater stress on the body, and most of the time they're just going to pass fatigue into failure. So I don't see a lot of inherent benefit to that exercise.
Yeah, Joe, I was actually going to say, like, my biggest problem with bench rows is the technique. I think if you drop the weight, and if you went a little slower, and kept the butt and the belly tight, like that would change a lot about it. Like bat wings, for example, I know some of you guys use them. Bat wings are similar in terms of like your chest down and you're squeezing, but it's a very different amount of load, and you're not throwing your weight around, and you're not doing everything you can to make sure that the bar touches and your rep counts.
And it's not a max. That's the other thing too, is that I can't believe that there are programs that use it as a max indicator, and with particularly with rowers who are such hard workers naturally, if you tell them it's a max, they're gonna PR, right? Just through sheer willpower alone. Uh, so yeah, you're just increasing that exposure then by not only picking a flawed exercise, but then loading it really, really heavy and getting them in a PR mindset. All right, so I promised beforehand that we wouldn't rant on that for too long. So I'll mention one more misconception, which is, Blake, you mentioned not using back squats. I tend to use the front squat or the single leg squat as well, but I think that squat depth is a big misconception. That there's actually higher shear forces on the knees and therefore greater injury risk with above parallel squats than there are with deep squats. The other thing too is if you don't have the mobility to deep squat, you probably are also lacking mobility when you come around to the catch in the rowing stroke. So it's one of those things where it's both an indicator of mobility failure and also greater injury risk by cutting the lift high and only going above parallel.
Yeah, that's a great point. You can, if you possess the requisite mobility and can demonstrate the control to go through a full range of motion, then yeah, you can squat deep. But it's exactly like you said, you get into trouble when you don't possess those prerequisites and you're asking your body to, access a range of motion it's not yet capable of or hasn't accessed in a very long time, and then you add load to it. Yeah, bad things are going to happen.
Cool. All right. Well, if we don't have anything else to add in terms of avoiding injury in the weight room, I know that one thing that we said we were going to talk about is Blake's back injury. So, Blake, I know we've talked off air about this, but you want to tell us your personal story with the back injury?
Yeah. So I rode 4 years in high school, started my freshman year, um, ended up getting recruited to college, and my first semester at college, um, I didn't have any back issues, or at least that I knew. And my coach decided to switch sides to give me more opportunities to get in the top boat. And there was just one day where my low back was just on fire, and a ton of pain, and it felt similar to what I'd felt before in terms of like it just felt like a really hard workout, and I'm sure all rowers have felt where their backs just burnt from a long time on the water. Um, and that's what I thought it was, and then it stayed like that, and it hurt in everything I did. Like I couldn't lay down without pain. I couldn't walk. I couldn't sit. Like every single thing I did was painful. Um, and so I rested for a while, and eventually it went away, and I was really excited, and my coach eased me back into it, and he said, why don't you try warming up on the erg? And I ended up having to crawl off the erg after that, and it came back. And long story short, I basically spent 3 months going to different doctors, and they eventually found out that I had 2 herniated discs, and I had stress fractures on both sides of my one of my vertebrae, so it could actually slip out of alignment. Um,
Brutal.
and yeah, I mean, unfortunately, it's something you live with, and I've learned how to manage it. But it is what made me, so passionate about this, and it's the reason why I'm trying to make people learn from my mistakes. And I wish there was more available when I was rowing. Like I didn't even know what a foam roller was. Like I didn't know what good strength training was. I didn't know about recovery. Um, so I mean, I think it's really important to do what we can and use what we've learned to make sure we can stop as much as we can from happening.
Yeah, I mean it's the Tommy John injury of baseball. It's, the ACL tear of football. Like every sport kind of has the injury that they're notorious for. But I think that we just see it in rowing so much, particularly with like the tall, promising high school recruit kind of guy goes to college and then something like that happens. I mean, did you ever figure out why it was or what the root cause was, or was it just the switching sides combined with other factors?
I mean, now that I know more than I did, my best guess would be, my body wasn't prepared for that. I didn't have the mobility um, to rotate to the right as opposed to the left, and I don't think I had the strength for it. Um, I also looked at some of the older pictures of me rowing, and I rowed with a spine that was very C-shaped. And if you look at basically all back injury research, it says flexion, so bending forward, bending sideways, and rotating, which is basically the catch position. They all say that that's the most dangerous position to be in. So eventually, like, there's going to be a breakdown unless you do what you can to minimize that stress.
And so, at what point in your career did you come around to strength training?
I actually started personal training just kind of as like a side gig to coaching, just like a stepping stone along the way. And then I ran into, Mike Boyle and some other mentors that kind of showed me that you can do a lot more with strength training than I ever thought.
And so now, what in particular do you do with your athletes to kind of try to prevent it from happening again?
Yeah, so a big thing for me is hip function. So making sure they have mobility in the hips, which means they'll use their lumbar spine less. Making sure they have strength in the hips. Making sure they have T-spine mobility, so they're taking stress off the lumbar spine as they rotate and side bend. And then really strengthening the core to resist motion as opposed to produce motion.
That's interesting. What kind of exercises for that last category in particular?
So anti-rotation holds, and then I have kind of different variations of that. Um, you can do basic planks, side planks, and then you can do different carries as well.
Cool. We'll make sure to put up links in the recap of this to some of those, as I'm sure that some of our listeners are interested in preventing the injury as well for themselves. Um, yeah, I don't know. Joe, do you have any questions there?
I don't have any questions. I just wanted to say thanks to Blake for sharing and his story and background and with the injury and perspective and stuff. I was just curious in terms of is there any what are some of your go-to T-spine and hip mobility exercises that you use?
It all kind of progresses, but I do this hip flow where I combined a Spider-Man stretch with the world's greatest stretch with a pigeon stretch. Um, so that would be my go-to for loosening up the hips. Um, I also do a few other things that are pretty hard to explain, but it's in the FRC world, and basically doing controlled circles with the hip joint. Um, uh,
Almost like manual therapy, like someone's walking you through those, or are you doing them under your own power?
no, you're doing them under your own power. It's hard to explain. We'd have to show you a video of that.
Are you shooting more videos yet?
Yeah, I have a bunch of them done. I just need to get around to actually editing them.
All right. Well, tweet tweet at Blake Gorley if you wanted to get on his horse and start doing that then.
Oh, and I
Um,
didn't touch on T-spine. T-spine, I mean, you can do a basic roll over the roller. You can use a peanut, so two tennis balls taped together. I like rib grabs, where you kind of lay on your back and you use your breath and you work on rotating the opposite shoulder to the ground. Um, incorporating rotation in different stretches. Um, yeah, that's where I get most of it.
Nice.
Awesome.
I think it's interesting how you came back to rest, and that so many rowers are so reluctant to take time off when they're injured. I mean, it's not only important to keep you healthy, but once you are injured, sometimes you just need to take 2 or 3 or however many weeks off that it takes to get you healthy again. I don't know. I mean, did you feel rushed at all in your path back? Because that's definitely something I see a lot.
Um, I didn't feel rushed, and one of the things I didn't touch on though was like the mental side of being injured, um, and it had nothing to do with my coaches. It had nothing to do with my teammates, but I felt like I was letting them down, and that was one of the harder parts. I don't feel like my coach rushed me back to row as fast as I could. I don't feel like he like put me in danger's way by, putting me back in the boat like and saying to go full pressure, and he didn't do that, which was great. Um, but obviously, like when you're in a team sport for that long, like you feel like you're letting everyone else down, so you're kind of rushing yourself.
Yeah, I think it's often not the coach that's pushing the athlete as much as it is the athlete pushing themselves, or disguising when they're injured, or saying they're fine when they're not, or something else like that. It's really hard, when you're a coach and you've got 30 plus rowers out there, you can't possibly be monitoring how each and every one of them accurately feels. And it's a hard sell to get the athlete to not feel like you felt.
Yeah, and I do feel like, whether or not it really doesn't matter how much you know, as long as you like make it a priority to keep athletes healthy and take steps to do whatever at that point in time. Um, you're only going to learn from it. You're only going to get better, and your team's only going to be healthier. But especially working with younger kids, so I work mostly with high school kids. I kind of feel a responsibility to look after them and to think about their future, because when you're in that position and you're young and you're strong, like you think you're invincible, and you do not think about your future. So if no one else thinks about it, uh, like there's no one thinking about your future, and then you could have a career ending injury that might affect you the rest of your life.
That's a great point for sure. Um, Shoot, I had something and I forgot what it was. Hmm. Joe, you got anything?
Um, Besides the mobility, is there any other tips or prevention strategies athletes should be aware of, specifically around low back?
Um, to be honest, I think the biggest thing for everyone, for all injuries, is really stepping back and looking at the bigger picture, and um, making sure you're looking at everyone as an individual. So like if you don't have assessments in place, that's fine. Um, if you want to do it at the most simple level, every single day, just go around and ask every single one of your athletes, how are you today? How are you feeling? Are you sore? Oh, you're sore? Where are you sore? Um, and at first they think it's really weird, and at first they won't really tell you anything. Um, but eventually they'll realize you care and you're actually trying to see what's going on with them. And sometimes they'll have something that you can prevent, uh, that day because you found it early. Maybe someone's left side of their back started hurting. um, give them a day off, give them some rolling and stretching to do, um, target that area, um, and it might not be a problem in the future. But if you let it go on for too long, um, I think that's where it becomes a problem.
Yeah, I remembered what I was going to ask, which was what are some of those red flags that you look for, uh, in terms of like the low back injury specifically?
Um, Typically, when they point at their low back and it's basically like, um, one side or the other, and it's on the bone as opposed to both sides and on the muscles. Because a lot of times people are going to be sore on the erectors and the muscles that run along your low back. A lot of times you'll be sore because you're using them, especially when you're building into it. But when it's asymmetrical, and when it's more towards the bone, and when it's something that's kind of lasting, and less muscular, that's concerning to me.
Good point. Yeah, the lasting thing is big because uh, with a lot of the low back soreness or injuries that I see, the difference between the two is that you can kind of stretch and massage soreness away, but the injury tends to, it's either a very temporary relief or it's not a relief at all, and then that's kind of when I start to get concerned. All right, well, if you guys don't have anything else to add, um, we got a reader question from Susie, who has some sort of sciatic nerve problem causing numbness and pain, specifically from rowing. She doesn't get any symptoms when she does any cross training, and her physical therapist says that she has good hamstring, quad, and glute strength, and no structural signs of injury like a muscle tear. Joe, I know we talked a little bit about this, but you've got some experience with the sciatic nerve stuff.
Yeah, I've had some athletes and clients that have experienced that. So the first thing that I would ask, or I would look at try to either see in person or a video of watching that person row, and make sure that they're positioned correctly on the seat. So you want to make sure you're sitting on your sit bones, which is going to allow you to hinge through the hips. If you're sitting on your pelvis in a manner where your hips are tucked underneath of you and you're on either your hamstring or your sacrum, you could be applying pressure directly onto that tissue, which is then going to hit that nerve. So that's the first thing. So make sure you're getting proper alignment. The second thing is you need to look at sort of other outside factors. So if this person has a occupation where they're sitting a lot, the tissues around the hips are going to probably be pretty tight and restricted. They're going to get a lot of that from rowing in and of itself. So making sure that the external hip rotators like the glute med, they have the ability to be loose and relaxed. So they might need to do some manual therapy, work with a massage therapist or a physical therapist, and have those muscles released. Doing stretches like elevated pigeon stretch is good. You might need to use a lacrosse ball, loosen that area up. And then progressing to exercises like the tactical frog, opening up the hips, and then see if that, I would try rowing again, see if it elicits the same response. If it gets better, you have some soft tissue restrictions that are clamping down onto that nerve, and you need to continue to work on that. If it doesn't get better, then you're going to need to probably have somebody further evaluate you and look at how you're executing during the rowing stroke.
I think it's funny. We'll talk about rest again because in the second part of her question here, she says her leg goes completely numb after about 10 kilometers, but she doesn't want to take any time off from rowing. So, Susie, take a break. Sometimes you just need to heal first, then start working on all that other stuff that Joe just listed off.
Yeah, Joe mentioned it as well, but it's also important to, even though you're seeing a physical therapist currently, they may be great, but they may not completely understand the injury, and you may need to get a second opinion and find someone else that may have a better idea, because they may just be missing something that stretching and strength training might not be able to address, and that particular therapist might not be able to address.
Good point. Yeah, and it's not necessarily anything bad about the physical therapist. It's just that you can only have so many experiences with so many sports, that there's definitely not, one good one for everyone. All right, well,
Yeah.
do you
No,
guys have
no.
anything you want to circle back to or injury-wise come back around on?
Not nothing that comes to mind at the moment. I'm pretty good. The only thing I would say is, yeah, I think it's always a good idea to get um, multiple views. If you're continuing to struggle with an injury and it's not going away, definitely seek second or third opinion if necessary, because you've got to identify and address the root cause of the issue.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that the body is this beautiful creation, and it's not that it's malfunctioning and you know it's just not doing its job and it's in pain. That's not how the body works. The body is triggering pain to tell you to do something, and that might be rest, that might be finding a physical therapist, um, but it's triggering you to take care of the injury as opposed to continuing to press until you break yourself down even more.
Hey, one thing that we didn't talk about was like special populations. So, youth or masters, or kind of anything out of like the conventional uh, rowers. I know, like for youths, one of the main misconceptions about strength training is that it's bad for your joints or it'll stunt your growth. That kind of comes back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of it not being safely instructed in the first place or supervised. You can't teach some 12-year-olds how to do something once and then expect them to be able to do it reliably and progressively, let alone under load. So safe instruction really comes back to that. And then the other thing too is that there's much less compressive forces put on joints through strength training than there is through running or jumping or doing anything else. So I feel like that's a big misconception. But do you guys have anything that you would do specifically, or injury prevention considerations specifically with masters or youth rowers?
Yes. So a couple things. For the master specifically, they need to make sure that they're maintaining a pretty good range of motion, uh, through the joints you're going to be utilizing in the rowing stroke. So ankle, hip, thoracic spine. So if you're spending a lot of time at a desk job, you're pretty much going to be glued down for 8 to 10 hours a day. So you add 15, 20 years to that, that is going to definitely change some of your posture. So that'll have a big effect on your ability to not only move through the rowing stroke, but move outside of rowing as well. The same thing with high school athletes. They need to demonstrate the requisite mobility, but what I see more from them is the ability or the inability to demonstrate control. So meaning they'll have tissue restrictions because they don't have the core strength or the reflexive stability inside. So the deep core musculature is not working. They're not diaphragmatically breathing, so they're not able to create 360 degrees of spinal stiffness. And so it just goes back to proximal stability for distal mobility, and they don't have it. So as a result, the body goes into survival mode, and it will create stiffness as a safety mechanism to prevent injury or from falling.
It's cool to see the from the sports psych side tie into breathing as well, that you can teach a lot of keeping cool under pressure basically just through breathing as well. That if you're not breathing well, one, you're going to have the risk of injury and stuff that you just mentioned. But the other two is you're going to start feeling frantic once you get 700, 1200, 1500 meters in. And there's a lot of like anxiety reducing stuff that you could do through learning how to breathe properly as well.
That's a really good and interesting point, and I would echo everything that Joe said. I agree. Everyone needs mobility, and as you get into masters rowers, it's going to be more of a fight to maintain as opposed to improve. But youth athletes need the same thing. Um, and and I mean, Joe explained it well, so I don't need to add to it. But I actually have been playing around with breathing recently with heart rate monitors and teaching my athletes to, work hard and then see how fast you can recover by using your breath. And I think that that's a really huge tool. Everyone gets to the starting line and they're extremely stressed out, and it's okay to be a little stressed, but if you're too stressed, you're going to have a frantic start, and it's going to screw up the first couple strokes. Um, and the whole race is a struggle if you don't control your breathing.
I've never heard of a relaxation contest before, but I like it.
I went through the Bioforce conditioning course recently with Joel Jamieson, and he was talking about using heart rate to teach people how to recover, and it's pretty interesting when you put it in front of them, because you would think, and most of the time it is pretty hard to teach athletes to focus on their breathing because they just think it's silly. But if you give them numbers and they see their own numbers and they're competing against others, they actually get into it.
Yeah, for sure. I like it. Um, any other special considerations for injury prevention? I know there's other categories of athletes that we could talk about. I think one interesting one is adaptive rowers having a higher risk of rib stress fracture. Kind of gets back to you're overloading the upper body, so making sure to incorporate some extra upper body training depending on what your abilities are to get back to that muscular balance. I hadn't really thought about it before I started really digging into all the rib stress fracture stuff, but it absolutely makes sense since the upper body peak forces are so much higher in adaptive rowers anyway.
So I don't have any experience or research I've done on the adaptive side, but the final comment I would make on injury prevention is learn how to hip hinge and make sure you do that in the rowing stroke. You pick things up a lot more in life than you probably are aware of or even give thought to, especially in daily life. Going to your car, picking up groceries, kids, moving stuff around the house, that type of thing. It's very, very clear in the research. Just look up McGill. Moving through the hips versus spinal flexion is spine sparing. So you greatly mitigate risk of a low back injury by moving through the hips. So think about that every time you go to put the boat into the water next to the dock.
Yeah, one of the biggest things that we teach is how to pick up with a stable spine as opposed to picking things up with a rounded spine. And that's where hip mobility comes in too. Is if you don't have the hip mobility, you just can't hinge to the extent you have to hinge at, and that comes back to the dangers of back injuries. If you're rounding your low back all the time, you're much more likely to injure it.
All right, well, I think that we can wrap up there then. I'll have Blake, why don't you go first? If you could just tell us where we can read more about you or find more about you on social media or ask you any follow-up questions. Then Joe after that.
Sure. You can find me on Twitter at Blake Gourlay. And you can find me at my website, rowingstrength.com.
My website's leotraining.io, and you can find same name, Leo Training, on Facebook, and Instagram handle is Leo Training.
All right, and I am at strengthcoachwill.com or at willruth335 on Twitter. So thanks to Row Perfect for letting us run the podcast on here, and thanks to you guys for joining me. We will do a recap of this, so I'll hit you both up afterwards for links and everything so that we can put up videos to what we've talked about. And please, if you're listening to this, let us know what you think or if you have any more questions. Thank you, everyone.